amidst the commotion of a gaggle of Yankee newspapers, fearfully bewailing about the potential economic consequences of the secession of the Southern states. Not only did they fail to mention a deep regret that slavery would remain in place as one of them, but many outrightly rejected abolishing it. On December 7, 1860, the Daily Chicago Times of Lincoln's home state of Illinois wrote that, quote, "Evil and nothing but evil has ever followed in the track of this hideous monster, abolition. Let the slave alone. Send him back to his master where he belongs." Close quote. On January 22, 1861, the New York Times said that action should be taken to, quote, "ameliorate, rather than to abolish, the slavery of the Southern states," close quote, which would allow slavery to become, quote, "a very tolerable system," end quote. February 2, 1861, the Providence Daily Post implored, quote, "We have no more right to meddle with slavery in Georgia than we have to meddle with monarchy in Europe," end quote. On February 7, 1861, the Columbus, Ohio crisis declared, quote, "We are not abolitionist nor in favor of Negro equality," close quote. March 7, 1861, the New York Herald, the most widely read newspaper in the country at the time, defended slavery, saying, quote, "The immense increase in the number of slaves within so short a time speaks for the good treatment and happy, contented lot of the slaves. They are comfortably fed, housed, and clothed, and seldom or never overworked," close quote. The question must once again be asked, does this sound like a society willing to spend massive amounts of blood and treasure to end slavery? Or have you perhaps been lied to by your history textbooks? Not only were these newspapers against abolition, but many also initially supported the South's right to secede. The editor of the New York Tribune, prominent Republican Horace Greeley, wrote, quote, "The South has as good a right to secede from the Union as the colonies had to secede from Great Britain," close quote. The Albany Atlas and Argus proclaimed, quote, "We must separate from them peacefully," close quote, and it blamed the Republicans for causing South Carolina's secession. The pro-Lincoln Indianapolis Daily Journal said, quote, "We are well rid of South Carolina. If the South follows her, let it," close quote. And the Northwest Daily Tribune expressed that if the South wanted to leave the Union and form an independent nation, quote, "they have a clear and moral right to do so," close quote. Not to mention that the mayor of New York City, Fernando Wood, sympathized with the South and wanted to join the Confederacy. The Cincinnati Daily Press affirmed, quote, "We believe that the right of any member of this confederation, the Federal Union, to dissolve its political relationship with the others and to assume an independent position is absolute. No party or power may say her nay," close quote. A Republican newspaper in Springfield, Massachusetts wrote, quote, "The idea that the free states intend to march armies into the seceding states to force their return to loyalty seems too monstrous for serious denial, and yet this is precisely the thing now declared by the incoming administration," close quote. And an Ohio newspaper, the Circleville Watchman, asserted, quote, "We are free to say that our idea of democracy, of the natural and unalienable rights of man, lead us to the opinion that any state of the Confederation, Federal Union, has, or at least ought to have, a perfect and undoubted right to withdraw from the Union and to change her form of government whenever a majority of her people shall be of the opinion that their rights encroached upon and impaired by the other states," close quote. But this spotty spirit of moral uprightness and constitutional erudition was quickly subverted by that of greed and preservation of the status quo. Southern independence and free trade was an assault on Yankee cronyism. Rather than creating higher quality products or lowering their prices to better compete in an open and fair market, the moneyed elites of the North decided that violence was the answer. The railroads companies, industrial tycoons, and bankers were beating the drums of war, and luckily they had the perfect corporate lawyer in place for its deliverance. They promptly provided the federal government loans for the invasion of the South. After analyzing the sudden shift of sentiment in the Northern establishment, prominent abolitionist Lysander Spooner accused the Lincoln government of working with the moneyed interests of the North quote, to monopolize the Southern markets, to maintain their industrial and commercial control over the South. These Northern manufacturers and merchants lent some of the profits of their former monopolies for the war to secure to themselves the same or greater monopolies in the future. These, and not any love of liberty or justice, were the motives on which the money was lent by the North, close quote. He was correct. This close tie between the Northern moneymen and the war effort would give the conflict the moniker, quote-unquote, the rich man's war. And the first step for these rich men was reclaiming the tariff enforcement and collection point at Fort Sumter, South Carolina. However, South Carolina had already seceded, and thus Charleston Harbor, where the fort was located, was sovereign water. President Lincoln knew that sending Union ships to resupply Sumter would compel the South to defend its waters from incursion and provoke an attack, and he did it anyway because he wanted the attack. And so the South's bombardment of Fort Sumter was what we would classify as a false flag operation today, meant to incite outrage in the North and justify an invasion of the South. But the political powder keg, which exploded on that 12th day of April in 1861, was one which was decades in the making. By 1860, the year before the Civil War, the South was less than 30% of the U.S. population. But, according to author Charles Adams' work, when in the course of human events, was paying roughly 90% of its taxes, and the Yankees wanted even more. Just imagine if 3 roommates out of 10 in a rented house were forced to pay 90% of the bills because the majority simply voted for it. As one would imagine, that would likely compel those 3 roommates to move out. This was the situation the Southern states were in as members of the Federal Union, and they put up with this type of exploitation to varying degrees, going back to the beginning of the country, when the federal government agreed to pay the debts of the states incurred during the War for Independence from Great Britain in the Compromise of 1790. The primary way this was financed was by tariffs on Southern commerce. This practice became increasingly egregious as time passed. In 1816, Congress passed a tariff that raised taxes on imports from 6.5% to 20.2%. This was acceptable to Southern representatives as a temporary measure to recoup damages to the country caused by the War of 1812 with the British, but it put an unequal burden on their economy, which relied heavily on low-cost imports and open foreign markets. Northern industries responded to this injustice by charitably charging even higher prices for their goods, holding the South as a captive market due to the tariff. The Tariff of 1824 went even further by raising the rate to 35% and was passed by only a slight majority of Congress. By 1828, the Golden-Goosification of Dixie was ever apparent and untenable for its economy, leading Senator Thomas H. Benton of Missouri to say to the Senate, quote, Virginia, the 2 Carolinas, and Georgia may be said to defray 3/4 of the annual expense in supporting the federal government, and of this great sum annually furnished by them, nothing, or next to nothing, is returned to them in the shape of government expenditures. The South must be exhausted of its money and its property by a course of legislation which is forever taking away and never returning anything. Every new tariff increase is the force of this action. No tariff has ever yet included Virginia, the 2 Carolinas, and Georgia, except to increase the burdens imposed upon them, close quote. In the face of these very overt grievances, and in spite of them, in 1828, Congress passed yet another tax hike on imports. This one the Southern states gave the nickname the Tariff of Abominations, which raised the rate to a colossal 47%. The Southern representatives were apoplectic. By now, it was blatantly evident that the Northern industrialists were selfishly enriching themselves at the expense of the South, which was unequivocally illegal. Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1 of the U.S. Constitution states that, quote, all duties, imposts, and excises shall be uniform throughout the United States, close quote. These tariffs were not uniform, unequally targeting Southern states. So in response to this last straw, in 1832, the South Carolina state legislature nullified the Tariff of Abominations declaring it unconstitutional. It had the right to do this under the 10th Amendment, and threatened to secede if the federal government attempted to intervene, with its Senator Robert Young Hayne proclaiming, quote, "South Carolina will preserve its sovereignty or be buried beneath it," close quote. It would behoove our sense of patriotic integrity to remember that the United States itself was founded on acts of nullification of British laws by the colonies, such as resistance to the Stamp Act and the tax on tea that preceded the Boston Tea Party. A state asserting its sovereignty in this way was perfectly in line with American tradition. In a monarchical fervor, however, the president of the time, Andrew Jackson, responded to South Carolina by vowing to collect the tariff by force, if necessary, and raised an army of 27,000 men to do so. A crisis emerged in Congress as a result of the standoff, leading to a compromise in the form of the Tariff of 1833, which would gradually roll back the tariff over 9 years until 1842, when it would go back down to 20%. But this reprieve from conflict would be short-lived. In 1842, the Republican precursor Whig Party pushed through a bill that raised tariffs from 20% to nearly 40%, known as the Black Tariff. Its economic consequences were disastrous and caused the Whigs to lose both houses of Congress in 1844. As a result, rates were lowered back down to 25% in 1846, known as the Walker Tariff, and again to about 20% 9 years later in 1857. Political tensions did again subside in the time between the Black Tariff and the Tariff of 1857, due in large part to an economic boom during the 1850s, along with the Whig Party collapsing in 1854, allowing the Democrats to temporarily stave off more northern predations, but the South was still a vassal state to the North, paying 85 to 90% of all federal taxes and seeing little in return for it. 80% of this revenue went to public internal improvement projects, which mostly benefited the North, such as railroads, and subsidies to northern industries. The United States remained a country on edge, and it was yet another tariff which would cause it to plunge into the abyss. According to author Samuel Mitcham Jr., quote, "In 1858, Republican Representative Justin Smith Merrill of Vermont introduced the Merrill Tariff in Congress. It raised the average dutiable ad valorem tax on imports from just under 20% in 1860 under the Tariff of 1857 to more than 36% in 1862 and a whopping 47% within 3 years." Close quote. Additionally, the tariff would impose rates of 250% on certain items and raise the Southern economy's federal tax burden to 95%, according to some estimates. Overall, these were the highest taxes in the country's history up until that point. Mitcham continues, quote, "Predictably, some of the protected northern industries and corporations needed to import specific items, so these were classified as non-dutiable, not taxed," close quote. Republicans had gained control of the House of Representatives for the first time in the 1858 midterm election. They were a more radical version of the Whig Party with regard to tariffs and government interventionism. As a result, the new Republican Speaker of the House, William Pennington, assigned the Merrill Tariff Bill to the Ways and Means Committee, whose chairman was none other than Republican Representative from Ohio John Sherman, the brother of prominent Union General William T. Sherman. The bill, of course, made it through committee and was passed by the House in May of 1860, 7 months before South Carolina became the first Southern state to secede from the Union. This is important to highlight because establishment historians contend that Republicans passed the Merrill Tariff not to further engorge the federal government and enrich the North by subjugating the Southern people, but to finance the costs of the Civil War, thereby dismissing that there is any legitimacy to the claim that the war was fundamentally fought over economic reasons. But how can this be the case if the bill was passed 7 months before any secession that led to the Civil War occurred? Additionally, the bill was signed into law not by Lincoln, but by his predecessor, President James Buchanan, on March 2, 1861, a month before the provoked bombardment of Fort Sumter, which ignited the war. Moreover, when running for president in the 1860 election, Abraham Lincoln campaigned on passing the Morrill Tariff, and raising tariffs was one of the planks in the Republican Party platform, so clearly the intent to raise tariffs was there long before South Carolina's decision to secede. The South predicted that it would be further plundered by the Lincoln administration, and it was correct. Lincoln made no gestures of goodwill or friendship towards the South upon being inaugurated, appointing radical Republican Senator from New York William Seward as Secretary of State and Ohio Senator Salmon P. Chase, namesake of Chase National Bank, as Secretary of the Treasury. On the night before South Carolina's secession, Georgia Senator Robert Toombs railed against the Morrill Tariff, validating that with it Yankees were, quote, united in a joint raid against the South, close quote, and that the Treasury had become, quote, a perpetual fertilizing stream to northern industries, and a suction pump to drain away our substance and parch up our lands, close quote. This notion was ultimately supported by the railroad lobbyist Abraham Lincoln being elected president with 40% of the vote in 1860 without winning a single Southern elector, thereby leaving him owing the radical Republicans of the North everything politically and the Democrats of the South nothing. The Civil War was not about slavery. It was anticipated that tariffs would be the cause of sectional strife long before 1861. In 1828, during a debate in the House of Representatives, a Southern congressman stated, quote, "If the union of the states shall ever be severed and their liberties averted, historians who record these disasters will have to ascribe them to measures of this description, tariffs. I do not sincerely believe that neither this government nor any free government can exist for a quarter of a century under such a system of legislation." Close quote. The Dixie states saw the writing on the wall. The Morrill Tariff was the Tariff of Abominations all over again, but worse, because this time they did not have the political recourse to fight it. The North's population was growing at a much faster rate than the South's, due largely to mass influx of European immigrants, which would inevitably allow it to take away seats in the House of Representatives. It was only a matter of time before the Senate followed suit. And so, South Carolina asserted its sovereignty from the federal government once again, similar to as it had done in 1832, but exactly as what it had done in 1776, due to a vastly disparate number of straws being placed on the back of the Southerner camel than on the Yankee one. This unequal weight snapped the spine of the former, causing it to forge a new one made of iron. The Palmetto State seceded from the Union, but what needs to be emphasized, which is often overlooked in the way the history of the Civil War is taught, is that the bifurcation of North and South was about more than a disagreement on economic philosophy. We will look at these reasons next.
Thank you for watching that episode of Cancel Lincoln. If you enjoyed the video, do me a favor, hit the like button and subscribe to my channel while you're at it. It really goes a long way in spreading the content. Thank you again, fellow rabble-rousers.